All right, good evening, everyone. Dr. Randall Gates, board certified chiropractic neurologist, also a chiropractic physician at Gates Brain Health. Tonight I'm talking about MCAS again, mast cell activation syndrome, and its association to stress, heightened physiologic stress, psychological stress. So if you have any questions, I am taking these presentations and I'm typing them up. So please email us at info@gatesbrainhealth if you want the written version of this broadcast. So I'll have that banner down here throughout the presentation. Okay, I think that pretty well summarizes that. And where is my slide? Here it is. Okay, so kind of the story behind MCAS, as many of you know by now, but if you don't, I'll summarize it, is that several researchers were looking at the association between these conditions that involved heightened histamine activity, as we would commonly note it, such as like rashes, urticaria, asthma, allergies. And they started seeing other associations to other diseases. And they inquired whether or not maybe the physiology of mast cells, which prototypically release histamine, but they actually release a lot of other things, maybe that the other things being released could be a common explanation for systemic symptoms seemingly unrelated to allergic disease. Now, Dr. Lawrence Afrin is probably the most well-known individual, rightfully so, who really put mast cell activation syndrome on the map. And he wrote a wonderful book, Never Bet Against Stockholm, that I mention in each of these broadcasts. And it's noteworthy because he's a hematologist. He was working in an academic medical center. He was receiving the toughest cases, and he came to a similar conclusion as others who were doing research at the time. But he came to an independent conclusion that many people with these mysterious chronic illnesses have this overactivation of their mast cells. He started going down a path, as he illustrates in his book, and I'm not speaking for him, I'm just kind of summarizing my viewpoint of his book. And he goes down a path of trying different histamine-based treatments for these individuals with chronic illness. And he was using medications that I have listed here. So some of the H1 receptor blockers. So you would think of it as the type 1 receptor for histamines, such as loratadine, cetirizine, diphenhydramine, fexofenadine, levocetirizine, which is Izol, or the H2 blockers, such as Pepcid, Tagamet, montelukast, cromolyn, that's a mast cell stabilizer. Montelukast is a leukotriene inhibitor. All these things, I probably don't need to go through all that. But he was trying these different medications, different combinations of medications. He describes that's kind of his protocol. You just have to do trial and error. If someone's not responding, they have a really significant disease, he may use types of chemotherapeutic medications such as imatinib. And there are other types of medications similar to that. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. I don't use chemotherapy drugs. And he had some wild results. He had some patients who were chronically ill, and all of a sudden they started getting better. He also talks about the efficacy of supplements because a lot of his patients responded to supplements. I've seen that in clinical practice. That's primarily what I use. So different diet strategies may work for some MCAS patients, vitamin C, DAO supplementation. The DAO enzyme breaks down histamines in the gut. Rutin, quercetin, luteolin, black seed oil. So these different therapies and in different combinations is kind of becoming the gold standard in managing mast cell activation syndrome, which is probably where a lot of you are at. And the question becomes for many of you is that you're doing this type of therapy, but maybe your symptoms are really vacillating and you can't figure out why you're not responding. And you're good 1 week, you're bad the next week, you're good for 3 days, you're bad for 7 days. What are the correlations? What other factors could be going on in your physiology? And that's really the gist of this broadcast, because tonight I'm talking about how stress may be a more significant factor than we have realized in the provocation of MCAS symptoms. So we will hide that. Go back to that, hit that one. And I think I'm going to go to this diagram here. So this article is, we have the reference up here by Bouillon, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was discussing mast cell activation syndrome as it relates to several neurological disorders. So that's what this article was focused on. But it was also focused on how corticotropin releasing hormone impacts mast cells. So when we are under stress, and I actually think I'll switch between slides, but when we're under stress, our brain perceives the stress. I've talked about the amygdala a lot. The amygdala is the central structure in the brain that is responsible for coordinating fear-based responses, involved in anger and aggression responses, involved in depression. And this overactivation of the amygdala can lead to, or to simply activation of the amygdala is going to lead to basically the front part of your brain, the hypothalamus, talking to your pituitary, and corticotropin releasing hormone is involved in that pathway to then lead to something called ACTH being released, going down to your adrenal glands for cortisol to be released. There's also a pathway that runs down your spinal cord directly down to the center of the adrenal gland to release adrenaline. So, point being is that we have found that mast cells have corticotropin releasing hormone receptors on them. In fact, 2 different types of receptors for corticotropin releasing hormone. So could it be that your MCAS symptoms are all over the place because of changes, fluctuations, and stress that you're going through? And this is a really important point that I think we need to really understand and kind of hold on to and keep it with us going forward. Because mast cell activation syndrome probably is relating to most chronic diseases. I did a talk, I think it was last week or the week before, it was 2 weeks ago, where I talked about how mast cell activation syndrome is connected to multiple sclerosis potentially, and celiac disease, and all these other diseases that you may not think of, irritable bowel syndrome, potentially headaches. And so we also know that there's a overlapping pathway with stress with a lot of chronic conditions. And I've talked about how stress will lead to increased levels of cortisol. Cortisol breaks down bodily tissue, breaks down the gastrointestinal barrier, because I've been hyper-focused on how the foods we eat can interplay with the gastrointestinal barrier, lead to autoimmune responses. But now we know that mast cell activation syndrome is this parallel pathway to autoimmunity for a lot of people. And not always parallel, but it can be parallel in a lot of cases. As you read Dr. Afrin's book, you'll see that a lot of these patients have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So it's not uncommon for there to be autoimmune issues along with MCAS. So now you're under chronic stress, perhaps. Maybe you're under vacillating levels of stress. And these stress hormones through corticotropin releasing hormone may be significantly impacting how your mast cells are acting. So maybe you're eating cleanly, maybe you're taking 1 to 3 different antihistamines, maybe you're on a mast cell stabilizer, maybe you're not on any of that, maybe you're on supplements, maybe you're on supplements, diet, and antihistamines, and you're just not getting the response that you want, or your symptoms are all over the map. Well, then it's really important to tap into and say, okay, well, what are my stress levels? What is going on in my life? You know, we are in the era of post 2019, and a lot of us have been under a lot of stress for a couple years now, basically. And so with that, what are all these stressors doing to our mast cells? Because the heightened stress may be causing your mast cells to lead to increased IBS symptoms. Maybe the heightened stress is leading to your mast cells provoking more headaches. Maybe the heightened stress is leading to your mast cells causing more bone pain or more rashes or trouble breathing or sinus symptoms or fatigue or dizziness or cerebellar symptoms. I mean, I could go on and on. I probably am. Or heightened pain beyond bone pain. So in this diagram, saying all of that, and good evening to everyone who's joining. In this diagram, you can see that I'm diagramming how, or I'm showing how the amygdala deep in the center of the brain talks to the front part of the brain. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone. That ultimately is going to lead to modulation of mast cell activation, not only in the brain, but throughout the body. And that can lead to the secretion of a number of cytokines. Cytokines are immune messengers, think of them that way. Chemokines, histamine, tryptase, chymase, vasoactive compounds. All of this can disrupt your blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is really important for anyone who has brain fog, concussions, autism, Alzheimer's disease. I mean, you name a brain condition and the blood-brain barrier is super important. Multiple sclerosis. So what we're seeing here is that when mast cells are too active and they're releasing their contents, which are more than just histamines, we can get disruption of the blood-brain barrier. Very significant. And then we also see that there are neuroimmunological connections, releases of all these cytokines, which are these chemicals. So hopefully that gives you kind of a window. And then also I'll hide this, show this one. This is a really nice diagram kind of depicting this hypothalamo-pituitary activation, the release of corticotropin releasing hormone, how it breaks down the blood-brain barrier, how it's affecting your memory area. And let me tell you, the memory area is the key structure in your brain regulating the fear response. So this is another pathway. Aside from cortisol damaging the memory area, now we have another pathway of mast cell activation syndrome and the contents of these mast cells being deleterious for the neurogenesis and the hippocampus. So your memory area, the hippocampus, is the one area of your brain that's clinically significant in most cases. The others are olfactory bulb. Now that's significant given what's going on in the pandemic. But basically your memory area produces new brain cells throughout your entire adult life. Cortisol is like poison for neuronal growth in your memory area. Well, we're finding that these contents of mast cells are really not good for neuronal growth in the hippocampus. So now you have, if you're an MCAS patient, you can see how maybe you're getting stuck into a vicious cycle, and maybe why things are not resolving. Maybe they are resolving wonderfully for you and you're stabilized, great. But if they're not, maybe this is a window. And just a nice summary of what I've said is up here on the slide. So let me know your thoughts. I'm always curious. Let me know your thoughts, what you think of this. I am going to talk about more of the estrogen, testosterone hormones and their impact on mast cell function, because there are a lot of questions about that. I still have so many topics to cover within the mast cell domain. I really think that, again, mast cell activation syndrome is the elephant in the room that we've been not seeing, and now it's no longer something that's been hiding. It's something that's out in plain sight. And so we just need to explore it even more so. We had a question about black seed oil. Yeah, that's black cumin seed oil is a supplement that's being used for stabilizing mast cells. So if you have other questions, let me know about that. Probably need to do a whole broadcast on each one of these. So I think that's pretty good. I think that's good for tonight. And let me know your questions again. Dr. Randall Gates, board certified chiropractic neurologist and chiropractic physician, signing off, and I will talk to all of you soon. All right.